everybody. Happy Black History Month and welcome to the Redefining Freedom podcast. This is our second podcast in the new year, and we're launching Black History Month today with a really special guest and an important topic as we consider the history of Black people in the United States at a time where books are being banned, history is being banned. There are fights over affirmative action and DEI and what diversity looks like and what equity looks like and whether or not we ought to have reparations for slavery and past harms. And I have with me today to discuss all of this Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. She is the endowed professor of Virginia Black History and Culture. She's emeritus director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for the Study of the African Diaspora and former dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Norfolk State University here in the great Commonwealth of Virginia. She is the author of several books relating to the experience of Black Americans from the time we landed on the shores in Virginia in 1619 as slaves through the Underground Railroad, the Civil War, segregation, into this very present day. She is an amazing academic, a brilliant scholar, and I am deeply honored to have her here with me today because we're going to focus on a very unique topic that's getting a lot of national media attention right now. And it's happening right here in her backyard in Hampton Roads and in the Commonwealth of Virginia. WHRO and ProPublica, as you may be aware, have done this amazing series on restorative justice around the takings of Black people's lands, the displacement of Black communities, families from their lands that they've owned for generations to make way for public universities and private universities alike throughout the South. In the spotlight is my former university, Christopher Newport, and they are under fire for the takings of lands and the way the Black communities were displaced. And there is a commission that's been established. There's going to be a study of this and a lot of conversation about what happens next. Dr. Newby-Alexander, thank you for joining me and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for this invitation, Sophia.
Well, listen, what I like to do at the outset here is tell us a little bit about yourself and what you study, because you have a very unique title of history there at Norfolk State. And just give me and our listeners kind of a overview of the historical context that leads us to this very issue we're talking about today.
Sure. So you've asked a historian to really tell us about everything. So I'll do my best.
You got it. We're all ears.
All right. So I am a Virginia native. I've lived most of my life in Norfolk, Virginia. And I have studied and have a passion for African American history. And I would say it started with my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, telling me about her family and how her father was born in Liberia. He was the son of two missionaries who I later found out were also big-time abolitionists who were involved with the Underground Railroad. I didn't know that part until I actually started doing research on my book on the Underground Railroad. And so what I've found all of my professional life and my life in general is that there are no accidents. And so when you're drawn to certain fields, it's because not only you have a passion, but I think there's a call from your ancestors to uncover what they've done and to ensure that we do not forget. And I'm reminded of what William Still, who was the station master on the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia.
Listen, I grew up in a small town outside of Lawnside, New Jersey, which of course was a major stop from Philadelphia through the Underground Railroad, and the Stills were in high school with me. That's how long that family has been around, and still to this day, their descendants are still around in that Philadelphia, South Jersey region. So just a little bit of history there.
Wow. Well, see, what he did was he did everything. He risked everything to not only record, but to preserve the history of those individuals who passed through his station and their stories so that people would not forget.
Absolutely.
And what I find when we're talking about the experiences of Africans and African Americans in America, is that too often the story, our experiences, and our lives are not only changed and altered to fit a different narrative where we are always featured as the villains. We're always featured as the ones who are impoverished, the ones who are costing the city money, the ones who are a burden on society, the villains, the criminals, and so forth. But in doing so, it gives an excuse to remove us from the landscape. And so that has been our history as we've struggled to be not only named, but to be respected as citizens of this country. We keep going through the same pattern of dehumanization. And I'm reminded of something that Malcolm X said years ago when he said, if you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it out all the way, that's still not progress. The progress is healing the wound that the blow made. And
Let's
so
put a pin in that for a moment because that's a powerful quote, one I'm familiar with. And just to give our listeners around the world context, again, it's Black History Month here in the United States, and this issue has come up whether it's been Georgetown University, Dr. Newby-Alexander, and the selling of slaves that helped to build the university. Georgetown, we're talking about not the University of Virginia in former, slave, in a slave state like Virginia, but we're talking about all the way up to Boston and universities there, and we're finding out all kinds of things about how Black people, to your point, were used to build this country, literally brick by brick. The universities, etc., are displaced and not compensated, run off, ill-treated, and how we're still dealing with those systemic equities to this day. And I think that's really important that folks understand. We're not talking about 200 years ago or 300 years ago or 75 years ago. We're talking about right now. Go ahead and finish your thought.
yes, and what you see a lot of these predominantly white institutions do is once they remove the land, once they've taken what was owned by Black people,
And
then
profited off it, by the way, greatly.
Absolutely profited by it. They turn around and in their guilt, once it's uncovered, once they're forced to face their guilt, then they give out a few scholarships.
Yep.
They put up a memorial. But that's not reparations. That's not healing. That's just pacifying yourself for the evil that you did to other people.
Yeah, let me dig into that. Let's kind of turn the corner on that because we're on the video podcast and we'll dig into this more on the audio. I like to do both versions because people who are midlifers like us like the audio more in the car, and the young folks want to see us and see us engaged. So I like to do both. But turning this to Christopher Newport for a moment in Newport News, set the table for why there's such a spotlight here, because I can't imagine folks haven't known this was going on for decades, right? So why now? And great work, by the way, WHRO and your wonderful team of journalists for uncovering, as the professor said here, because things have to be ripped open for us to talk about them. But Dr. Alexander, it reminds me of the George Floyd situation in 2020, when you had all of these corporations pledge hundreds of millions of dollars in scholarships and this and that in new positions, and very little of that has come to fruition. And Christopher Newport was one of those schools where, President Tribble opened his mouth and got himself into some trouble and had some pushback when he wrote this open letter about the protesters in Richmond who had done some damage to his son's store and how he really felt. And then he had to backtrack when he got a lot of, feedback from the community and the student body saying, hey, you're not doing this right. You're not leading right on this issue. They created a DEI position. One of my sorority sisters filled that position, Dr. Springer, who's since left. And they created a scholarship, but that was it, to your point. Talk to us about what's going on specifically in Newport News right now and Christopher Newport, and why it's such the big issue.
So the community, they often refer now to as Shoe Lane, but it was
Hmm.
more than just that one street. It was multiple streets, multiple areas within an area of Newport News that was surrounded by upper middle class and upper class whites. There was a golf course nearby. There was a special club there. And so this community was at risk simply because they were in the wrong place. Um, and whites wanted to remove them from the landscape. And so Paul Tribble, when he became president of Christopher Newport, with his political connections,
Yeah, he was a U.S. senator, people that don't know, and a U.S. congressman. He had a very storied career in the 80s.
yes. And so he used those connections and the power of the government with eminent domain to begin to take the land, supposedly for public good. And the way that it is usually crafted is they will designate something as run down, as a slum. And there are no
Economic
parameters.
development, right?
Yes, there are no parameters for that designation per se. You could have, for example, a broken fence, and now it's a slum area. It's inadequate housing. And that's the way, the device that government has used eminent domain when they want to take away, especially land from African Americans. And I'm not saying that other groups of people have not had their land taken from them
Yes,
through
they have.
eminent domain, but that has been the typical way. And of course, Virginia is, as well as a number of other states, is notorious for using eminent domain when they were constructing the interstate system to completely destroy Black neighborhoods. So through the city of Richmond, they destroyed the Jackson Ward and they tore out the heart of the Jackson Ward, and that was the business community. You saw the same thing in Hampton, Virginia. Downtown Hampton used to be the Grand Contraband Camp that was started during the Civil War. That was the place where the first Black-owned bank that was incredibly successful was started by a man who
Wow.
came to the shipyard when Huntington created the shipyard, and he reached
Huntington
out and
Mangles
grabbed,
now, right?
right, he
Yeah.
grabbed this man named Brown and and got him to come to the area so that there would be a place for the workers at the shipyard to deposit their money so that they could build wealth. And so Brown's Savings Bank was created. That was located in downtown Hampton. But the city eventually stopped providing resources, stopped fixing the streets and making sure that there were sidewalks and street lights and sewage systems that worked and so forth. And pretty soon the area was slowly getting dilapidated, not because the people were abusing the areas or because of their wealth or lack thereof, but rather because the government refused to put resources. And so once it started looking bad, then the city came in and declared that area in the 1950s and 60s to be blighted.
So
And
there's this collusion that goes on, if you
yes,
will, right,
yes,
between public and private and the
yes.
university systems to say we need this land and we've got to figure out. In one of the articles that I read in the WHRO series, this is a great point you made. They actually literally said we got to remove the black spot because, like you
Yes.
said, it was surrounded with wealthy white suburbs. But what I want to talk about while we still are on the video, and we can get into more of the meat of this in the audio version of the podcast, but talk about, let's fast forward. Okay, we know what's happened. You've explained kind of how this works. Folks, by the way, before I ask my question, this is why history matters. This is why you have to teach accurate history. And what you do is you other people and make them look like they're always asking for something or they're always whining or they're always complaining. When in reality, no, that's not at all what's happening. They've been wronged. There have been injustices done. They've had things taken from them that they worked for, that were rightfully theirs. We talk about the American dream. We talk about the great promise of America. It can't just be for some of us. It has to be for all of us. And we're talking about here historical inequities that lead me to my question, which is, Doc, one of the things that came out in the series is not just the way the university came about seeing you, but then when you begin to look at the numbers, Black faculty, Black students, the idea that Paul Tribble had that he wanted to create a private university kind of imprint at a public school, and it has excluded people who look like us. I was on adjunct faculty there, and as you know, the first Black female scholar they ever had there, and that didn't go so well for me. But the point is, I had no idea that there was all this history. Now I know, and I'm going, makes perfect sense. Now I get it. Talk a little bit about how when these takings happen, when we take land and whether it's indigenous land or from African Americans, how that then filters into the structure that's supposed to be a public institution of learning. You get my question? The nexus?
Yes, it actually reminds me of the post Brown versus Board of Education decision here in Virginia, in which through massive resistance, the school systems, the public school
Barbara
systems.
Johns, right?
Yes,
Yes.
and once those school systems were closed, and her case in Longwood was one of four different cases, but they all basically were about the same thing, which is that segregation is inherently unequal, that the cities are actually, and counties were actually taking money from Black parents who are contributing taxes, and they were taking some of that money and shifting it to white schools so that it didn't matter how prosperous Blacks were, they still were not going to get their full tax base. And they had to go to a handful of schools in an area. Like, for example, Norfolk had 5 high schools, but Blacks could only go to 1. So you're talking about a population that's almost half of what's in the city.
Right.
All those kids only going to 1 school while the white children went to 4 separate schools. And so what we would see time and time again is the use of public funds for the benefit of whites and to the disadvantage of Blacks. CNU, even today, has less than 2%,
Yep.
of their student body
In a
is
44% Black city, right?
less than 2%. And
There
it's
it
even
is.
smaller for the number of Black faculty.
Yep.
And Black faculty, and I'm a UVA graduate, and I remember when I was there in the 70s that the argument was, well, we can't find any competent Black professors. And I looked around and I said, I'm sorry, but are you telling me that all these white professors are far more competent than any Black professors? The only ones who are competent are the Black professors, the ones who are at Harvard and Yale and Princeton. You're saying that's your regular faculty body, so it's that constant need to demand that Blacks are 10 times better, but then what are you offering them to bring them to that institution? And the level of hostility.
Ooh, wee! You preaching, girl. You preaching.
And that's why many Black faculty will not stay there, not unless they ignore
Yep.
the sound. And I'm going to be a little political here
It's
and
okay.
basically say, these are the Black Republicans. If they could ignore the bigotry sounds that are coming at them constantly, then they can stay at those institutions, not unless they have a real strong back and a strong stomach to endure what they have to go through on a regular basis. And I know I have several friends and colleagues who are at those institutions, and they tell me, some of the things that they have to endure. Never mind that HBCUs have the most diverse faculty of any higher educational system in the country.
Absolutely.
About a third of our faculty, at least a third, are non-African American.
Same at Howard, same everywhere. You're right. There's a lot of
And
white faculty and white students. They're smaller, but
yes,
they attend. But
And
let me
so
get back to your point, because you and I will go on and on forever because this is a hot, juicy topic. But to your point about, Black conservative faculty who may say, I can look the other way. Well, hand raised, moderate Black conservative here, Republican my whole life up until 2015, and we all know why I left the Republican Party. But very much into my love the Constitution, religious liberty, all things that are pretty conservative. And yet I ran into the same exact hostility that you're talking about, only I'm not one of those people that's going to sit back and let you treat me that way and do that to me and not raise my hand and push back. And what I found was, as we were doing our research about CNU and everything happened with me and the abject hostility that I was treated with over something that was utterly ridiculous, and it was used, as Dr. Kendi says, as a pretext. They find something that we've done that's offensive or upsetting, and then they literally publicly lynch you in a new way. Not a rope around your neck, but they find a way, like with Dr. Claudine Gay at Harvard, and I want to get your thoughts on that. Instead of attacking her on the fact that her testimony, as well as the other two presidents' testimony, was truly unconscionable, they should have said, look, hard stop. We do not tolerate anti-Semitism and calling for the death of Jews. That's not acceptable. And if it happens, we're going to deal with it. Instead, they listened to a bunch of lawyers who told them the wrong thing, and they tried to have it both ways. That was a fail. But what they did was come at her on her scholarship, her intellect, her ability. She's DEI, she's affirmative action. Let me tell you this, Dr. Newby-Alexander. When I became the first Black scholar and then everything blew up over my tweet and all this hostility started, they literally changed the scholar in residence program at CNU so that there were so many different ways that it had to be checked off that somebody like me, who didn't have the Ivy League credentials or whatever credentials they deem necessary, can never get in there again. It was so racist and so hostile and so openly so that when you step back and you listen to what you're giving as the context in the 70s, we're still doing this in 2024. Talk to me about your thoughts about what happened at Harvard to Dr. Gay and how it relates into what we're talking about now in this restorative justice and systemic racism.
I think that there is a generation, the Gen Xers, that generation that was not brought up under the shadow of segregation.
That's me.
Right. And they, you saw maybe some discrimination, but it was seen as individualized as opposed to institutionalized.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a baby boomer. I grew up, the first 5.5 years of my life, I was in a segregated school.
Wow.
And I saw the differences that a middle-class Black school, the resources that we were given versus the resources given to a lower income white school. They had twice the amount of resources that we had. And so there's no way anybody could argue that it was money. It was about race. And so I grew up, well, I was probably feisty from the beginning, but I grew up feisty because I was taught by my teachers that you don't let anybody talk down to you, that you do not accept any of these, what we call racist tropes coming
But you had Black teachers, right?
I had Black teachers.
There it is.
They knew who they were. They had grown up in this world, and they warned us. And plus, I had parents who told me the same thing. But I think many people in the Gen X generation did not have people teaching them this
That's
information
right.
and giving them an idea of what they're facing, who's going to be attacking them, how they can come at them, and how you stand. And I always think about that in the Bible where it says, having done all, stand, therefore, with your feet shod and, your breastplate and your shield and your helmet. I have lived that, where it doesn't, I don't need anybody as an echo chamber standing up along with me. I'm going to stand if I'm the only one standing. And I find that that's very effective. I have told, for example, state commissions, stop Jim Crowing our history, where you
Yep.
have a black side and then you have the American side, which is really
Yeah,
just
like they're not
white.
congruent, right? Like
Right,
they don't
right.
fit together, right?
Right. You know, what they're doing is they're calling American history is really white American
Yep.
history, throwing in a little bit of information about blacks and natives that don't make them feel guilty or
Dr.
bad
King's
about it.
speech, and they take it all out of context. Soror Bernice is one of my dear friends, and we've talked about this many times. I actually set up a call with her and Governor Youngkin. This is not many people know this through Kay James, who was our Secretary of the Commonwealth and a dear friend, and when they were trying to deal with that curriculum issue, and I said, listen, I want to get Bernice on the phone to talk to him, and luckily that had some impact because they backed off taking out Dr. King out of the curriculum. But every white conservative, every white person wants to pull the line out of the speech about the content of our character. They don't want to deal with the promissory note part and the other parts, the Dr. King. But we got to wrap this because we're going to run out of time on the video. I want your thoughts on Dr. Claudine Gay and why they did what they did to her. Why did they do this? What was the issue?
So I got sidetracked talking about
Okay.
the Gen X generation. That generation is not equipped to be on the hot seat.
Neither is Y or Z either. Trust me, they're worse.
That's true. That's true. This is the beginning. And so I saw her milky toast statements as a reflection of why she was even there,
Yep.
of why she was selected as president. Because if she understood and knew who she was and knew why she was there and knew what she and others had to fight for to get her there, she would not have allowed anybody to beat her down.
Absolutely right.
If she got a degree from Harvard University and somebody's accusing her of plagiarism, my first response would have been, well, I want to know where my professors were who were overseeing my dissertation, if indeed I was plagiarizing. And if that's the case, then there are a whole lot of other people who have that issue. So, you have to think outside the box when you are responding to racists who really want to beat you down. And I know that too many African Americans, and especially women, get into positions and think that they cannot be bold because they feel like they got in that position because they kept quiet.
Yep.
They stayed in a safe place.
And that's the point, right, that we're talking about earlier, going back to seeing you. When we began to dig, like you said, you've been around a long time and you know this because you've had colleagues, but as we began to look at court records, them being sued and not letting black women have tenure and not doing this and that, it was really stunning to me, the systemic nature of the racism that is completely overlooked and accepted at a public university that takes Title IX funds, that takes state money. And like you said, it's this fiefdom of what used to be one man's fiefdom. And now the fallout's coming, and it's going to be interesting to see. But back to your point about Claudine, you're saying basically that she should have expected this, right? This kind of attack.
If she didn't expect it, she should have known how to defend herself against it. I saw her stay quiet, except to write an op-ed piece after she had resigned.
Yep.
I didn't see her fighting. And that I thought was a real problem.
But you know why, right? Because trust me, there was a deal. I'm a lawyer. And what they told her was, look, you can't withstand these plagiarism allegations. These boys like Bill Ackman and Rufo and these guys, they're coming for you. So we're going to let you keep the $900,000 salary because she got to keep that, and you go back to your tenured faculty position and you keep quiet. Basically, she's fallen off the radar. No interviews. I promise you, she signed a non-disclosure and she agreed to be quiet. I'm not condemning her. I thought the way she was treated was horrific. But
I thought
it was what we're talking about.
Well, I thought it was as well, but as long as you remain silent for your own personal gain, there will be no progress.
Yep.
And when you're in a position like that, I believe in the whole idea of race men and race women. This goes back to the latter part of the 19th and early 20th centuries, in which what we do, because we're not at that point where we've arrived
Absolutely not.
as a race of people. We're far from it. And all you have to do is step a toe out of line and you get thrown back with everybody else. And
And it's
so
hard when you're the first because there's such an awesome responsibility on you when you're the first to not mess up. I covered the Obamas as a correspondent their first term in the White House and through their second term. And they were meticulous about understanding what they could do, what they couldn't do, how they had to maneuver. It was like the beer summit. Remember when President Obama went to the defense of Professor Gates when the cop arrested him? And they had to have this beer summit with Joe Biden being there, kind of brokering the peace between the cop and him to talk about it. Whereas, had it been a white president like Bill Clinton, he could have got up, condemned it, and there would have been no pushback. We have a double standard burden on us that is serious to carry.
but at the same time, the objective is what? If you allow for yourself to have a white broker in between, I think it's time that we stop playing the game
I
of,
agree.
of needing white people to feel comfortable with a situation. We're going to be a threat regardless. I don't care what Obama did. He was seen as a threat. He's not been in office for many years. He's still seen as a threat. And it's because he is not only an intellectual powerhouse, but he is so strategic and such a political animal in the sense of he understands the politics. What I think he had to learn was that bigots are bigots are bigots, and they're not going to change. And if you're going to be condemned for taking a stand on what you believe is right, not trying to pacify a bigot, because a bigot will never be
Yeah,
pacified.
and I think that this whole new language we have, there are a lot of, and we'll get into, I want to talk about campus free speech and how black folks don't have the same free speech that our white peers have as colleagues, as academics, as students, etc. And just get into like this whole backlash that we're experiencing right now, particularly in academia. Academia, I want to wrap with this. Your thoughts on the suicide of Dr. Bonnie Bailey, a black woman dean at Lincoln University in Missouri, was being harassed and bullied by the president of the school, as well as we've had a number of our black female HBCU presidents die while in office, stress, heart attack, stroke. What are your thoughts about black women in academia as we wrap up in these last 5 minutes?
I think a lot has to do with the age of the person and the perspective that that person has. And what I mean by that is that those in my generation and the baby boomer generation were basically told you had to be a female version of a man in order to succeed at certain levels. And so now you're being taken out of your comfort zone and put in a very uncomfortable zone of trying to be something that you're not. Instead of finding your place and your voice. And so many, I think, black women feel like when they get in certain positions, that they have to behave a certain way instead of just throwing that playbook out and finding their own voice and their own way of doing things. But you have to be strong. And, the other thing is that a lot of people don't know that so many board members are basically political hacks. They are people who are social climbing, or they're climbing in terms of their political connections. And some of them are just horrible individuals, and they have sexually harassed different administrators, including the presidents, and these women just don't know how to react because these individuals are their bosses,
They're powerful.
and so they don't have the tools to handle those situations. And so I'm not surprised that we're seeing sort of the backlash, but it's in a way that is really harmful to the health and well-being of of these African American women who are in these positions of authority. I think Black women, first of all, need to begin to learn how to find their own voices and how not to try to be or how not to fit into somebody else's confines, because that is very, in terms of your health, very harmful.
Yeah, let's talk about that more on the podcast. As we wind down, folks, I want to encourage you to join us over on Spotify and Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. We'll have our regular podcast. But I really appreciated this video dialogue because it gives you a chance to see us. It gives you a chance to get a feel for the human being. And Dr. Newby, this has been good stuff. I could talk to you forever, and I'm looking forward to coming down to Norfolk in state in end of March, I think it is. Women's History Month, and spend time with you guys. We're gonna have a good time. But this has been a good discussion. It's not as robust as I would like it to be. I'd like you to be on for a couple hours, but we can't do that. We're gonna continue on the podcast, folks. So we'll look forward to finishing discussion there. But again, the context is Black History Month. We're talking about this restorative justice movement, this reparations movement, and systemic racism that still exists. And Doc, I'm gonna want to talk about how we deal with systemic racism on the audio. Okay, everybody, we'll see you on the audio podcast, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Newby.
Thank you so very much.